Welcome to WEO's CRC Expert Working Group webinar. This webinar is organized by Group Polyp Detection, Characterization, Resection, and AI. Without much further ado, I'm handing over to Global Chair Evelien Dekker.
Thank you so much, Alexandra. As a chair, I'm very happy to open this session today. I'm very happy to have the second series of webinars already of this year, 2021. This is actually also the second one of those two working groups. I'm very happy to have on board so many nice speakers, all organized by the two chairs of the working groups, Daniel van Renteln and Yuichi Mori, who will also chair this session. So I hope you will enjoy it. I also hope you will join in for the other two webinars that are still to follow, December 2nd and 9th. With great topics as well, great programs. And I think for now, for not being able to join live, I think this is really a very nice way to still communicate with each other and debate. So please join. And I do hope to see you next year, hopefully at DDW, where we are now counting on planning a plenary session, but of course this will all depend on the situation by then. So without further ado, I give the word to Yuichi Mori and Daniel van Renteln, and I will be joining in and look forward to this session. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Evelien. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone in the world. My name is Yuichi Mori. I'm an endoscopist at the Oslo University Hospital and Oslo University Hospital. And together with Daniel, we are chairing this session devoted to the polyp detection, characterization, resection, and AI. Today, we are preparing very, very ambitious program, and one of the parts is organized by myself, and the other one will be done by Daniel. So let me introduce some introduction slide to explain further. So in the first part, we are picking up a very challenging and ambitious topic, which is the roadmap to obtain reimbursement for the use of AI in colonoscopy. I intentionally picked up this topic because of its importance in dissemination of newly developed technology in colonoscopy practice and colorectal cancer screening. Therefore, this topic matters very much for us as endoscopists and also for some CRC screening program persons. Let me just introduce 5 or 6 slides followed by the fantastic speakers. This is my COI. And just let me briefly introduce the 5 basic steps for implementation of AI in colonoscopy. Apparently, product development is mandatory as a start point. Then we should make some evidence based on the clinical trials. Then, based on this kind of data, commercialized industries are able to obtain regulatory approval in the world, including Europe, Japan, Asia, and the United States, and other rest of the world. Then we may get some financial support from the public health insurance body, which is called reimbursement from the insurance. Then, as a final step, we may able to create a long-term effectiveness of the use of AI with a very strong endpoint, such as the cancer mortality or incidence. Let me just review the current status of the phase 1, which is the product development. Surprisingly, we have already got more than 400 publications in the field of AI in colonoscopy. Most of the publications are preclinical assessments or development, namely the publications are closely related to the product development. Then, surprisingly, we have already obtained or got more than 10 randomized controlled trials or RCT in the field of AI in colonoscopy. To the best of my knowledge, this number is the top in the world of AI in medicine. So in a sense, we are leading the field of AI in general medicine. Then, most importantly, there are roughly 15 or more items which have already cleared the regulatory clearance, regulatory approval in the world, including Europe, Asia, United States, and other countries. So this number is really big. And so which means that we are almost able to use and implement these technologies immediately, maybe today or tomorrow. However, because of the lack of the reimbursement, honestly speaking, use of AI has not been widely spread. This is quite important topic. Given the effectiveness of AI is already approved by some RCTs, I guess we are eligible for getting some reimbursement or financial payback from the health insurance body, but it has not been happened. That's a really big pity. That's why we picked up this topic as a core of this discussion in the part A. Let me just briefly describe how the journey to obtain reimbursement is very tough. For example, the application process is highly complicated, and apparently multidisciplinary collaboration will be needed, including the physicians, companies, maybe politicians, economists, or other roles. So it's very, very complicated. And unfortunately, most importantly, the reimbursement systems differ according to countries, regions, and sometimes hospitals. But most importantly, the requirements have a lot of things in common. Let me introduce the core requirements to obtain reimbursement, regardless of the regions, countries, or hospitals. There are roughly 4 items. Number 1 is regulatory approval. This is a prerequisite to obtain reimbursement, apparently. Then we have the health tech assessment by the authorities based on the clinical effectiveness and cost effectiveness. Then we do need a guideline recommendation or maybe position statement from academic societies such as WEO or ASG, ESG, or JGS, or other such societies. Of course, some amount of budget will be needed to cover the new reimbursement. So budget from the public health insurance is mandatory. Among these 4 items, number 1 and number 4 are, in a sense, out of control from the physicians because the companies are in charge of the regulatory approval, and the budgeting of the public health insurance is highly political. But I think regarding the number 2 and number 3, there are a lot of things that we can contribute to. Therefore, today, I and Daniel are inviting 3 keynote speakers to give us inspiration on how to overcome this most important hurdle in the field of AI in endoscopy. We invited Professor Cesare Hassan from Italy, Professor Masashi Misawa from Japan, and Professor James East from England. And today, I'm very, very happy to have this kind of super contributors in this field. Thank you very much for your participation. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce the first speaker, who is Cesare. And Cesare is a super famous endoscopist, but I just make one comment on his recent promotion. He has got a professorship at the Milan Humanities University last September, and he just moved from Rome to Milan, which is a really big news to us. So Cesare, are you ready? The floor is yours.
Yeah, Yuichi, thanks so much for the very nice introduction. And of course, I fully support your innovative view on the need of reimbursement. Unfortunately, here in Europe, we are not so good in getting reimbursement, but we are doing better. And I agree that the algorithm with the 4 phases that you show fully applied to Italy, for instance, and probably to a lot of European countries. So I agree also with you that in the health technology assessment, cost effectiveness is critical. Let's make one step back. What we know today is that colonoscopy is effective and probably cost-effective in reducing colon cancer incidence and mortality. There's no doubt about the efficacy of colonoscopy. However, we also know that there is some miss rate, and that this miss rate somewhat influence the endoscopist detection rate, and this may affect the initial efficacy of colonoscopy in preventing colorectal cancer. However, the impact of quality on colorectal cancer incidence and mortality through the endoscopy is not so clear. However, if we think about quality of colonoscopy and colon cancer screening, about the fact that by improving quality we can increase cancer prevention, we were not so good in getting reimbursement until now. And I ask myself why. So maybe quality of colonoscopy is considered as a center or endoscopist related issue. It's not a patient related outcome. The quality is on the side of the endoscopist, not on the side of patient. Usually health system give reimbursement for patient related outcome and not vice versa. If you look maybe at Italy, but also other European countries, a very well structured, formal quality assurance program with training, retraining, measuring, feedback, auditing, like GLAMS is like so much. It was actually never implemented. And even a formal training that should be reimbursed in order to have a better patient outcome it's not available, at least here in Europe. Of course, there are some training courses, but never with the idea of getting reimbursement. And similarly, endoscopic centers always rejected the idea of a pay for performance. That is, the higher the quality, the more reimbursement I have. Also because it is difficult to estimate center by center what the financial impact of quality is. However, we feel that that AI is different from the previous approach in quality. In fact, the previous approach, as I said, was on the endoscopist, not on the patient. So the idea was I target the endoscopist, I improve the endoscopist, so the endoscopy has a less missed rate and less interval cancer. On the other hand, the artificial intelligence is much closer on the side of the patient. Artificial intelligence does not want so much to improve the quality of the endoscopist. Artificial intelligence wants to prevent the error of the endoscopist, irrespective of whether this error is due to suboptimal quality, to tiredness, distraction, or whatever reason. So AI is much more centered on the patient and somewhat is a more concrete approach to the issue of missed lesion and missed cancer. Is artificial intelligence effective in reducing the miss rate and improving the quality of colonoscopy? The answer, as anticipated by Yuichi, is yes, because randomized trial and tandem trial always converge on the fact that CAD-E increases the ADR and at a similar rate it reduces miss rate. So there is no doubt on the efficacy of CAD-E. Here, Yuichi, if we should do a health technology assessment, probably the part on the efficacy would be terminated by a slide like this. However, this is not what is enough to predict the cost effectiveness and the benefit of artificial intelligence. What we know is that increase ADR, that's all. What we know is that it reduces operator variability, that's all. But we also know, on the side of cost, that increase the number of polypectomy. Most of them are for non-advanced adenoma. We also know that artificial intelligence has a cost because there is a hardware. there is a graphic interface, there is a software, all of this has a cost. And probably it increases surveillance colonoscopy, and Yuichi and myself recently showed a 10% increase in surveillance colonoscopy. So it is still, what we know is that there are some benefits, but there are also a lot of costs and probably a lot of harms. However, there is something that we do not know about the cost effectiveness of AI, and this would be important in health technology assessment. What we don't know is how to translate the increase in ADR in a long-term colon cancer incidence and mortality prevention, because the target of a screening program is to prevent incidence, is not to detect adenoma. In addition, we are probably penalizing AI because it is true there are a lot of costs from hardware, but we can save on the colon cancer treatment if we prevent incidence or if we downstage an already colorectal cancer. And again, we don't have a precise estimate on the impact on surveillance. So for this reason, we did a cost-effective model that is the usual model that is used in health technology assessment. And the basic idea of the model is to compare the benefit of AI in terms of cancer prevention, but also the two competitive cost drivers, the reduction of cost due to cancer prevention and the additional cost due to much more number of polypectomy. What we did was a Markov model in Amsterdam. Evelien is very good with this. And we compared three strategies: natural history, standard colonoscopy, and AI-assisted colonoscopy. We based it in the United States, but we also did a European simulation. In the America, because the pay-for-performance is somewhat more accepted, and because most models are based on the American population, also because the primary screening colonoscopy is somewhat dominant. This may be a good scenario for estimating the cost and the benefit of AI in colonoscopy. Because, for instance, if we did it in Europe and it would be based on FIT program, it would be driven much more from FIT than from the contribution of AI in colonoscopy. So the American model, probably for colonoscopy, is somewhat an artificial model that is very good. So what we show in this model that is in second revision is that the absolute increase of incidence reduction of colorectal cancer would be 5% when we assume a 60% uptake of colonoscopy screening in the United population. So the overall cancer prevention would move from 44 to 49, and there would be a 3% mortality reduction. But what is important is that this 5% absolute increase in colon cancer incidence would reduce so much the cost in the treatment of colorectal cancer that this saving would fully compensate the additional cost of AI that was estimated about $30 per person, as well as the additional cost of polypectomy. So at the end, artificial intelligence is a cost saving. This is the graphical representation that Yuichi prepared. You may see 5% incremental reduction for incident, 3% mortality, but especially a saving of $60 per any American citizen in between 50 and 100 years. So it is a cost saving. And this is the projection with the 60% uptake on the American population. Every year, we would prevent 7,000 more colorectal cancer, 2,000 deaths, and we would save in between 200 and 300 million of dollars, and this is quite relevant. So the conclusion is that in a health technology assessment, this technique would be considered cost effective, cost saving, and probably one of the most effective and simple intervention we can do in in the field of colonoscopy. If you want to hear more, I'm sure that all of the panel here is also in Prague before the DDW, and so we can have a good place for discussion. Thanks so much, Yuichi.
Thank you very much, Cesare, for your fantastic lecture, as always. So because Cesare is leaving very quickly due to some reasons, so I'd like to take some time for Q&A after right now. But for the other speakers, we are securing the different time for the discussion. So Cesare, I have two quick questions. One is the situation in Europe, because the data is calculated based on the American population, and the healthcare system and the finance is completely different between the United States and the remaining areas in Europe. What do you think about the situation in the, let's say, Italy? Can we implement the result in the Italian financial system?
Yeah, thanks, Yuichi. Yeah, I feel that Europe is different, especially the public sector. If medicine is so somewhat popular in America, it's also because the American health system is by far the most expensive worldwide. So colonoscopy is extensively reimbursed in America, but also colon cancer treatment is extremely expensive. So I guess that here in Europe, the problem is that the reimbursement for colonoscopy is very low. For instance, in Italy, from the government, we don't have more than $100, while in America, you have about $700 from Medicare and over $1,000 for the other insurance. So I guess that reimbursement for colonoscopy is an issue in Europe, and for this reason, we need additional reimbursement for AI. Because if we need to pay AI with the reimbursement we receive from the government for a simple colonoscopy, we would be bankrupted.
Yeah, that'd be a very interesting idea. We have the James. Do you have any comments?
Yuichi, thank you. I just wanted to ask Cesare both two linked questions. One, does AI help detect serrated polyps? And if it does, did you include serrated polyps in the prevention of serrated pathway colorectal cancer in your modeling for effectiveness, given we know that endoscopists are not very good at detecting those? Yeah,
very good point, James. Unfortunately, here in Europe, and especially in Italy, the prevalence of success-related lesion is extremely low. In Italy, we have a 1 to 2% per patient prevalence against 7 to 10% in the United States. So despite the trend was present in the meta-analysis, we didn't reach the significance. As you said, the most difficult polyp to be identified is a success-related polyp, and what is difficult for us is not difficult for the computer and vice versa. So I'm expecting a big beneficial effect of AI in detecting serrated polyp in the next 5 years. What this means in terms of cancer prevention is another issue, because it deals with the natural history of serrated polyp. But here we have the queen of serrated polyp, Evelien, and she knows much better than me what serrated polyp really means in terms of cancer. I'm not fully convinced, but what Evelien says is true.
So. Evelien is also raising her hand.
Yes, I was also raising my hand, not specifically on this topic, but yes, I agree. Serrated polyp should be included in the detection, and well, what we do know is that the serrated polyp, the cancers that are detected after colonoscopy, so despite colonoscopy, so the post-colonoscopy colorectal cancers have an increased rate of mutations coming from the serrated pathway. So for sure, we have an issue there, and maybe in the future we will know whether also serrated polyp detection rate does connect to interval cancers. So I was coming from the other side, although I'm a great enthusiast about AI, and I think there's lots of possibilities and improvements for this in this aspect in endoscopy. I just want to ask the devil's, how do you say, the devil's advocate question, whether it's not possible to just improve the quality of the endoscopist instead of using AI.
Yeah, Evelyn, this is a very good point. Of course, I was exaggerating. Quality of the endoscopy should be the first target of training and retraining programs. But you know what convinced me about AI is that even the best endoscopy in the world, like Yuichi, or whoever I know and I met personally, when they are doing their colonoscopy, they always keep AI switch on. So I guess that on the back of our mind, all of the experts know that they can miss polyp, and AI is a guarantee. And so I would consider it, Evelyn, not a replacement, but as a parallel thing to quality. So there is quality, then there is AI, and then there is the patient. So yeah. AI is what it is between quality and the patient. But of course, we need the quality. We cannot give everything to AI. But I believe in AI because all the experts I see, they usually use in their own practice.
So Cesare, if I would scope you, you would want me to put the AI system on, right?
But maybe in that case, you would have so much coffee that... Yeah, okay. My first colonoscopy would be with you. I never did the colonoscopy. We can't to Amsterdam. When I come to Amsterdam, I will have my first colonoscopy. Okay.
All right. Thank you very much for your great discussion. Yeah, thank you very much, Cesare. Unfortunately, Cesare is leaving, so I would like to have Evelien in later during the discussion session. So we are running out of time. Sorry for my management skill, but I'd like to introduce the second speaker, which is Dr. Misawa Masashi from Japan. He's introducing the impact of using CAT-X from the financial perspective. Please.
Thank you, UH. Good evening, everyone. So it's my great pleasure to have a presentation regarding the cost effectiveness of AI for polyp characterization. So today I'd like to introduce our work for the cost effectiveness analysis of AI for polyp characterization. And then I'd like to introduce the current status of reimbursement for AI in Japan and the USA. As you know, the number of colonoscopies and related procedures such as polypectomy or EMRs are increasing year by year. Therefore, optical biopsy that has a potential to reduce the polypectomy-related costs are catching great attention. So here, I'd like to think about how does AI reduce polypectomy-related costs. If the negative predictive value for left sigmoid diminutive adenoma is more than 90%, leave in situ strategy is acceptable. And if the AI enable more than 90% surveillance interval agreement between the pathological assessment, resect and discard strategy for diminutive adenoma is acceptable. So in this way, accurate AI expected to reduce unnecessary polypectomy, pathology, and follow-up appointment and reduce these costs. So I'd like to introduce our work that investigated the cost effectiveness of polyp characterization using AI system, mainly targeting on the leave-in situ strategy. This was a post-hoc analysis of precedent clinical trial. This is an overview of the precedent clinical trial using polyp characterization AI system. In this study, we used the endobrain that can output pathological prediction, neoplastic or non-neoplastic, by analyzing endocytoscopic image. In this study, 466 diminutive polyps were prospectively enrolled and analyzed. The main result was a negative predictive value of AI for left sigmoid diminutive adenoma was 95.2%. Therefore, PB2 threshold was achieved in that study. And then this is a simulation study to calculate the cost reduction effect of AI by comparing two scenarios. First one is the live in situ strategy supported by the use of AI prediction. And second one is reject all polyp strategies. Under the live in situ strategy supported by the AI, 105 polyps would have been removed, and the rest of 145 polyps can be left in situ. So this resulted in 58% reduction of polyp removal. And here I'd like to introduce the polypectomy-related costs among 4 countries: United States, United Kingdom, Norway, and Japan. All values in this slide are shown in US dollars. As you can see, costs are varied among 4 countries, but the costs are lower in order of United States, and United Kingdom, Norway, and Japan. We calculated the cost reduction effect of AI using these data. Okay, this is the result of the cost effective analysis. The cost reduction rate are 7 to 90% among 4 countries. Annual saving costs are estimated at 149 million US dollars in Japan, and 85 million US dollars in the United States, and 12 million dollars in the United Kingdom, and 1 billion US dollars in the Norway. And this is short summary. The use of AI with even such a strategy will reduce 7 to 19 polypectomy-related costs. But the assumption of this simulation needs to implement AI into all colonoscopy units. Therefore, to achieve this cost reduction effect, the dissemination of AI system is very important. In addition, we have no data regarding the effect of AI on reject and discard strategy. And here I'd like to introduce the current status of the reimbursement for AI in Japan and the United States. First, I'd like to show the situation in the United States. As you know, many AI softwares have already launched in the United States. And USA set the new technology add-on payment, so-called NTAP, for AI software detecting the cerebral infarction, named BIS LVO. This is a very good news to spread such AI devices. However, NTAP will last only 3 years. So it means 3 years later, we cannot obtain add-on payment for this software. And furthermore, NTAP likely decrease add-on payment during 3 years. Also, there are some drawbacks for this system, but US decided to approve the reimbursement for the AI usage, and it will be a great help to disseminate such AI system. How about the situation in Japan? This was news in Japan in 2016, so 5 years ago. Japanese government announced that they would start the reimbursement for the AI system until 2020. However, unfortunately, AI was not included in the biennial revision of the reimbursement system in Japan. Actually, the Japan Radiology Society had applied AI add-on payment for this revision of the reimbursement in 2020. However, it was rejected because there were few evidence regarding the effectiveness of AI system at the time. Here, I'd like to show several factors that are assessed by Japanese government when they discuss the reimbursement of medical devices. There are several factors, but the most important point is the clinical effectiveness. Of course, enough diagnostic performance is mandatory. Additionally, Japanese government focuses on how is the AI system treated in the guideline published from the academic society. And then second one is cost effectiveness, because the reimbursement has a great impact on medical economy. Furthermore, the number of patients, target patients, safety, and ethics problems of validity are discussed. This is only Japanese situation. However, I think the situation is similar or applicable in other countries. Okay, this is my last slide. The polyp characterization with the use of AI is a promising tool for reducing clinical costs. To accelerate the dissemination of AI into clinical practice, the reimbursement for the use of AI is necessary. However, currently, reimbursement for AI is limited, as Yuichi said, so recommendation for the use of AI in the guideline would be needed. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Masa, for your excellent talk about usefulness of AI from the financial perspective. There are some questions from the audience, so I'd like to pick one of the questions from Dr. Omer Ahmad in the UK. And he's asking about a possibility of integrating the improvement of the AI functionality after launch in the market. You know, the functionality always is developing when it comes to the AI, but should we consider this improvement in the reimbursement process? You know, it's a very difficult to consider reimbursement once we get a new software. So what do you think about this matter?
That's a very important point, and it's a very difficult, I think it's a very difficult point. So actually, the improvement after the approval from the government for the AI system is currently limited, but Japanese government and the United States allowed us to, after launch the improvement of AI system. But regarding the reimbursement of AI and after launched the system, we have to evaluate its performance in the clinical practice after the improvement. So we have to clear the PB threshold or something like similar threshold to achieve leave in situ strategy or reject and discuss strategy, I think.
Oh, thank you very much. That's very important input because we haven't expressed anything regarding the acquisition of reimbursement, so we should discuss a lot of things about it. But I'm very interested in one situation because we have got a lot of the positive findings when we look at the publications related to the cost effectiveness and effectiveness of the use of AI in colonoscopy. But in the world, there is no reimbursement or payback from the health insurance body. This might be partly because of the lack of our experience on how to negotiate with the public health insurance body or authorities. In this regard, I think the James has had a really big experience because he played a really important role in implementation of the optical biopsy recommendation in the NICE statements in the UK. James, do you have any idea on how to integrate our knowledge, our experience, our publication into the policy or the financial issues in the countries?
I think my experience from that is that at least in NICE, it is driven by health economists. In the room where we made the decision, there were 15 health economists and 3 clinicians. Okay, so if you don't have health economic data and good health economic data, and they want to see, you know, proper analyses, they want to see modeling, you know, they want to see clinical effectiveness long term. If you don't have that data, it's very difficult, even though clinically it looks good, the economics are probably more important. And so, for instance, for AI, the only paper that looks about health economics, except for Cesare's paper that he's just presented, but prior to that, was your paper, which was presented last year. So, you know, despite the fact we have 400 preclinical papers and 10 randomized trials, only one paper has looked at the economics of this. And if you went to either the Japanese government or to NICE, or I suspect to the Americans, they will say, where's the health economic data? You haven't got any, or you haven't got any proper data, so we won't consider your application. It's not that they think there's a problem, but with no data, then they won't take it forward. So we need to engage with our health economic colleagues in a huge effort if we want to get this over the line. We need publications on all aspects, and I think your and Cesare's leadership has been great here. But you know, every country in every healthcare system needs to put forward and engage with health economists with different models and different ways of approaching this to try and have the data that will make this possible. Without the data, they can't help us.
Oh, thank you, James. I think your observation is very critical, very important, and very noble. May I echo your opinion? There are roughly 400 papers devoted to the clinical effectiveness. However, we have just one paper published in the field of economy devoted to AI in colonoscopy. That's a big challenge. So I think your comment is really important to the point. And we'd like to encourage the more number of researches, publications in the field of AI related to the economical validation. Daniel, do you have any comments or questions?
I think it's a really interesting discussion. And also what was said before, like I think with the increased detection right now, if we don't have resect and discard in place, we'll bump up the cost first. We'll find more polyps, more adenomas. We'll have earlier surveillance intervals. So we really have to look at that. What it does mean. Should we, if we do better quality colonoscopy, can we increase surveillance intervals? And when is the moment where we can really move to resect and discard? But I find it a very interesting discussion.
Sure. Evelien, do you have any comments?
Well, we have been discussing this quite a bit here in the Netherlands, and there's more than just the cost effectiveness issue. I think there's also many other less clear issues, like pathologists that like to do the pathology, for example, for the resect and discard, because they're easy and quick money for them. There's issues like how can we monitor the quality of the effect of the optical diagnosis of an endoscopist or a system. What should be the level of accuracy that is needed to do so? So there's many more issues, I think, than just trying to make clear it's the costs that's driving the issue. So many challenges. We are thinking about those as well. And you might be aware that we did some work for ESGE on trying to make the PV more useful, for example, using a threshold for the accuracy of a system. Because we need to know, right, how well the system is, and just knowing an accuracy, who decides whether it's good or not, or good enough, or same for endoscopists, but also for AI systems, I think.
Yeah, Evelien, thank you very much for your clarification. I agree with you. As you mentioned, our reimbursement process or application for the reimbursement is highly complicated, highly political, very, very cumbersome. And I'd say most of 99% of the physicians are not familiar with how to get a reimbursement. But clinical effectiveness of the use of AI is obvious, let's say. Then what I'm thinking right now is to disseminate some idea of how to sort out the requirements to get a reimbursement in the academic society or academic audience would be really nice. That's why I just proposed, well, if we can publish some position statement regarding this matter to you. Anyway, thank you very much for a very fruitful discussion. I would like to introduce the last speaker in this session, which is Professor James East. He's super famous, so I'd like to omit his introduction, but he is going to present a really important topic, which is how to implement the new health technology into the public endorsement statements or something like that. So James, floor is yours.
Yuichi, thank you. I'll share my screen. So it's a great pleasure to speak on this, and it's been great to have some time to think about this issue. So this is trying to embed optical biopsy recommendations into the NICE statements and how we might include AI in that. These are my conflicts, and I would just highlight that I was an advisor to NICE for this diagnostic guideline. So in terms of how we got here, how do we know we can do optical diagnosis and discard? And I think this was a pivotal paper in 2009 out of St. Mark's, where they showed that for polyps less than 5 millimeters with 6 different endoscopists, they could get an accuracy for optical diagnosis of 92%. And that's very close to the pathological diagnosis rate, and you could achieve the PIVI criteria. So 8 years later, 2017, the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence issued this guidance, virtual chromendoscopy to assess colorectal polyps during colonoscopy. And I will point out 2 things here. So NICE is not a national society guideline with clinicians. It's an arm's length government agency that defines healthcare standards for England and Wales. So if NICE say you can do it, you can do it. In fact, you probably should do it. And at that time, the first deep learning papers on computer-aided diagnosis were just coming out. So we didn't really have that data when we did our searches to develop this guidance. So what did NICE say? So essentially, they made the headline 4 recommendations. So they did recommend this, but with these qualifications. So you need high definition enabled virtual chromendoscopy equipment. And I think pretty much all endoscopy units nowadays are moving or have fully high definition equipment and have narrowed spectrum endoscopic technologies embedded in their systems. This is more difficult. So they require the endoscopist has to be trained to use virtual chromendoscopy, accredited under a national accreditation scheme. We certainly, we don't have that in the UK, although there is individual training. We don't have accreditation in a national scheme. And I think this is a big barrier as this is set at the moment. The third component, Evelien alluded to this, systems to audit endoscopists and provide ongoing feedback for their performance. We can do this just manually by counting up our polyps and checking the pathology and seeing what our AI prediction was compared to the pathology. But it's hard work and cumbersome. The final part is that the assessment is made with high confidence. And I think now, as we train in AI with train with advanced imaging for optical diagnosis, the concept of high confidence is well embedded. So this was the situation as we came out of the NICE guidance, that we thought that we would require training, and potentially we need to train thousands of endoscopists. And the kind of training we were offering at that time, much of it was maybe classroom-based and with in-room mentorship. And the thinking was that practicing colonoscopists, it might take them 1 or 2 years to reach the appropriate level for accreditation. We would then need to audit their practice, and if they pass their audit, they might be reaccredited, or they might require further training. And the question comes up, who can accredit? Should it be national bodies? For us, the Joint Advisory Group for Geoendoscopy. Could endoscopists accredit themselves if they can show the appropriate data? Or could industry support that accreditation process? And certainly there is already industry training online, and you can get certificates showing that you have developed some expertise in performing this, but that does not necessarily translate into clinical performance in vivo. And there is a risk that we might see headlines in the newspapers suggesting that we're leaving killer polyps left in to save NHS money. So there was considerable control that we might lose control, of that process. And there is some data to suggest that actually, being careful about this is quite reasonable. Although we thought MBI was very straightforward to learn characterization, in fact, in a number of community studies, despite apparently acceptable training performance, when you looked at performance in a wider over a long period of time, performance did not meet acceptable standards. So what about if we added in artificial intelligence? And so this is a little bit of a cartoon about how we might do that. So the box that I've got at the top there is what we're doing at the moment. So this is the MBI trained endoscopist characterizing, makes a high or low confidence call, and makes a diagnosis. But this isn't working. The training's too hard, it's too long, it's too labor intensive. And we have thousands of endoscopists to train, all of whom, or the majority of whom, are already in practice. And I think if COVID's told us anything, it's told us that web-based solutions are possible, and critically, this idea of being digitally scalable. If we can train one endoscopist on a webinar, we can train 1,000 endoscopists together on the same webinar. So I think there's a real opportunity and appetite now to go to web-based solutions. So this is what's proposed now with AI, the idea that AI supports the endoscopist, and this is currently available in clinical practice with devices like CAD-EYE. And this can be either as a second read, where the endoscopist makes a call and the AI then tells you what they think, and then you make a joint diagnosis, or, and this is really what's happening in clinical practice, the idea of a concurrent read where you and the AI system read together and make a joint diagnosis. This equipment is coming and will probably filter into units as equipment is replaced, but you can buy standalone. And as we've just heard, the cost savings may well justify the investment costs that we've had. A final option is a black box computer-assisted diagnosis where the endoscopist doesn't have any input and we just rely on the AI for decision-making. And while no expertise and training is required, I think there are very substantial regulatory difficulties here that Yuichi has alluded to. So what about current systems? Do they offer what we might need to achieve the NICE criteria? So this is an example from Mike Burns' paper in Gut in 2019. And you can see here that the AI system offers essentially instant expert level performance. The idea from NICE that we might have a high confidence assessment, you can see there's a sort of confidence indicator. But critically, these systems are very straightforward to use. They're very plug and play, and endoscopists can learn and engage with them very, very rapidly. So where do I think we're going? So this is the traditional competence pathway, and this is from the ESGE optical diagnosis position statement that Evelien led. And so here, in order to become confident in optical diagnosis, you need to meet the pre-adoption and learning criteria, and the ESG accept that this could be web-based. And then you need to meet those competence thresholds by assessing a minimum number of lesions prospectively during real-time endoscopy, potentially just in your own hospital. What if we added AI into this? So an AI augmented competence pathway where you learn with an AI system might help you achieve that performance level for competence even quicker and move the curve to the left. I would argue that with expert AI systems, it may be that, in fact, endoscopists are almost achieving competent level performance immediately, and that their training is just to optimize that with the AI system. What level of competence is required? Well, this is in press with endoscopy now, the SODA, Simple Optical Diagnosis Accuracy Standards, again, led by Evelien and Raf Bishops. So for resect and discard, you need 80% sensitivity and 80% specificity for high confidence characterization, whether or not you are a standalone endoscopist or AI supported. So what do I think the issues are that we have to solve for AI to incorporate it into the NICE guidance? We need to be able to rapidly accredit endoscopists either with some sort of training light that might be web-based or training plus, where AI is integrated into the training course. And in fact, this is what happens for current trainees if they're in a training hospital that has AI systems available. I think black box, despite no training being needed, is just, from a regulatory point of view, too difficult. I think the other bit, and again, Evelien alluded to this, can AI support or automate the audit of endoscopist performance? And I think that's another piece that the AI community needs to think about. And a final thought is that if endoscopists can demonstrate performance criteria, whether it be with or without AI, how much training and accreditation do we require, as long as we can show that we reach the performance standards? So this is the last, all right, going to be the last slide here. Here we are. So this is my last slide. So this is where I think we might go for AI optical biopsy in NICE. I think there's going to be a training component, and I think that's going to be web-based now, but we might use national societies to accredit those websites as being acceptable. For competence, we need to demonstrate competence thresholds with AI system support, but that might be just in our local hospitals. And then reaccreditation, I'd like to see built into the electronic patient record and our endoscopy reporting tools that might be AI driven with natural language processing to pull out the appropriate polyp pathology and match it with our AI predictions. But I think critically, if we're going to really move the needle on this, the solutions that we put forward need this idea of being digitally scalable if we're going to bring this widespread disruption to GI practice. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, James, for your brilliant lecture. And we got a really big inspiration from your experience-based presentation. Evelien, do you have any comments?
No, not other than that. I really like the thorough discussion of the several parts. I kind of alluded this a little bit already on my previous comment, but there's so much more than just the costs. It's the whole process that should be in place before we can really use it in daily practice. So no comments for now. I'll think about it. But I see Daniel has a raised hand, so he may start.
Thank you for this amazing talk, and I find it. I totally think optical diagnosis skill, should be something that should be learned. It is so important, for every endoscopist. What I find very fascinating to see that here with optical diagnosis, there is this. We feel we have this need for accreditation before we implement it, and that geared towards diminutive polyp with an extremely low risk of containing advanced pathology or cancer, and also very slow progression. And we don't ask for the same accreditation with other endoscopic modalities. We don't have accreditation if someone wants to start EUS. People can go do a couple weekend courses and start in their practice. ERCP, there's often a bit more formal training, but the same, we have different specialties. We have surgery, and GI has a completely different curriculum when we assume somebody is competent. And we have now here in our province, we have internal medicine specialists who will start endoscopy because there are some regions that are underserved in endoscopy. So I just wanted your opinion. So where's the balance, and do we need an accreditation for, in general, endoscopy, all procedures in endoscopy? And why are we so strict with optical diagnosis where the risk to miss something seems to be so low?
I think those are interesting points, and I'd like to respond on two of them. The first is about the level of accuracy that's kind of required. And as part of the NICE process, they modeled a variable range of accuracies. And in fact, as you suggest, these are low-risk lesions, and even if your accuracy is quite low, going down sort of 70% type level, it doesn't make very much difference to the modeling for the rate of colorectal cancer and death that comes from that. So being super obsessed with accuracy may not actually drive risk very much. The other component about whether we need to accredit, given that other areas of endoscopy don't, I think part of the issue here is that we are stopping doing something that historically we've done. So we're going to stop doing pathology, and that's a big saving. In fact, if you turned it around and said, for all these tiny polyps, in the US, to diagnose them all, and virtually none of them will contain cancer or be at risk, you have to pay $1 billion a year. Do you want to do that? Then the argument, the sort of healthcare economic argument, is perhaps a little bit different. But I think because we're changing a kind of a very sort of traditional model. And the pathologists will fight us in some areas, not in the UK because they're so busy. They're delighted not to have to do this work. But certainly in some places, they will fight and say there is risk. Patients need to be reassured, and so I think that's perhaps where this drive for accreditation has come from. But I prefer the idea that, to some extent, being, the value of accreditation it is limited. What matters is competence. And if you can provide the right level of diagnostic accuracy, however you choose to do it, either yourself or with AI support, whichever AI you choose, as long as you can demonstrate that and continue to re-demonstrate it continuously in your practice, then I think, it's reasonable to start implementing these things and making the cost savings, which could be put into, for instance, doing more screening colonoscopy, which is much more effective in preventing colorectal cancer, as we saw from Cesare's data, than looking at lots of small polyps under the microscope.
James, thank you very much. I have a different type of question to you. I think you have a really nice experience with the negotiation with the NICE, where you are the member of the NICE recommendation. So if you have a chance to propose the integration of AI in the NICE classification, not NICE classification, but the NICE recommendation, would you like to pick up CAD-E or CAD-X if you are asked to pick up only one of them? Which one is easier for you to implement into the recommendation guideline?
I'd say I think that there are pros and cons for each of them. I think at the moment, CAD-X, we don't have this issue where higher performance by the endoscopist can find lots of non-relevant polyps that generate expensive screening but don't prevent much cancer. And we don't really have good serrated data. Whereas CAD-X is maybe a more binary issue, and the way the cost savings come through are more straightforward. Perhaps because I've seen the process for that. So I think a CAD-X, and perhaps that's why it came early to NICE rather than Olympus bringing forward MBI for detection or another technology. I think is perhaps more straightforward at present.
Yeah, thanks, James. Actually, we had the same discussion within the Japanese Society of AI GI Endoscopy and reached the same conclusion. Maybe CAD-X should be prioritized with regard to the reimbursement for the use of AI. Well, we are running out of time, but I'd like to pick up the one question from the audience, which is from Professor Valoli. The question to James is, if the use of near focus is equivalent technology necessary for CAD-X? This is the question from Roland.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, you know, certainly the data for endoscopists about whether with high definition near focus adds much. I think it maybe adds a little, but I think for AI algorithms, I suspect even narrow band and near focus, I think there's good data suggesting that AI algorithms can get enough out of the image without the need for magnification or for narrowband imaging, that we may not, for the AI system to work, we may not need those augmentations. It may be that the human operator still requires those because we only use, you know, maybe 4 or 5 different aspects of the polyp, the shape, the vessel pattern, the pit pattern, vessel thickness, and a few other things. Whereas a deep learning system will look at, you know, hundreds or even thousands of parameters when making a decision that it can extract from the image. So for humans, I think it's helpful, but for AI, I suspect in the future, particularly as we go to say 4K, there will be enough information in the image that we won't need those things.
Thank you very much for your great answer, James. And thank you very much, Evelien and James, for joining us as a panelist. And also thank you, Masa, for joining us as a panelist from Japan during the midnight in Japan. Thank you very much. So now I'd like to hand it over to Daniel for the secondary session.
Yes, thank you, Yuichi. It's really fantastic to share this session with you. I also want to thank the WEO and Evelien Dekker for providing this platform, and which really gives us inspiring talks and these inspiring discussion. And you see, we're also excited about these topics that we're a little bit over time, but I hope you're going to bear with us for the next set of speakers, and we're going to shift our focus to polypectomy techniques. And we have Kevin Waschke from McGill University with us, who is an excellent teacher and trainer in endoscopy, who's leading many of the ASGE courses for polypectomy, the STAR program. And we have Jeff Mosko from Toronto University with us, who's one of the most skilled intervention endoscopists across Canada, very high level ESD and EMR skill. So I want to provide at the beginning a bit the background for standard polypectomy, and the risk of incomplete resection and how we can maybe address that. And I'm going to start my slides here. I hope my slides can be seen. And I also want to remind, please put your questions in the Q&A box, and we're going to answer them at the end of the talks. So these are my conflict of interests. And the talk outline for this introduction is I want to give a brief overview about the interval cancer risk and how it's associated with incomplete polypectomy, predictions of complete versus incomplete polyp resection, and then the experience transitioning to cold snare. I think that affects us all, and there has been a big shift in the guidelines in our practice towards cold snare in recent years. And now some trials we're doing with moving the wide field resection towards smaller polyp resection, and how that affects incomplete resection risks. Just a short overview, as mentioned before, missed lesions are the main risk factor for interval colorectal cancer. And we hope that AI and CAD-E solutions will help us and will help bring everybody to a very high level of adenoma detection rate. And then it's already followed by incomplete resection on new lesions. So incomplete resection is a big risk factor also for interval cancer. And we assume that 10 to 28% of all interval cancers are linked to incomplete polyp resection. And we have a relatively small population, Canada, 30 million only. And we think that about 1,000 colorectal cancers per year of the about 3,000 colorectal cancers we diagnose in Canada might be associated to incomplete polypectomy. And there's more and more data coming out. Heiko Pohl published some very good data recently showing that in the segments where there was previous polypectomy is where you find often recurrence and high-grade neoplasia. So it seems to be a real issue, and it seems to be also an issue that translates into an effect and a risk for patients of developing cancer. And we did recently a meta-analysis looking into how common is incomplete resection for our standard polypectomies up to 20 millimeter, and it is quite frequent. 14% in the studies that systematically assess incomplete resection for all 1 to 20 millimeter polyps. And as also confirmed by the guidelines, we should reduce our use of forceps polypectomy because it's quite high if we remove diminutive polyps. We should replace that by a snare polypectomy because the risk for incomplete resection is lower if we use snare, and forceps should be only used for 1 to 2 millimeter polyps and not going above that size threshold. And what we also see if we look into factors influencing incomplete resection, if the polyp gets bigger, the risk for incomplete resection also gets higher, seeing an about 20% incomplete resection rate for 10 to 20 millimeter polyps in our meta-analysis. And if we look at that, that is higher than a lot of the EMR studies. So what we see, EMRs are often referred to expert endoscopists, specialized techniques are used. And we see an incomplete resection or recurrence rate in that case of 15%. So it is concerningly high in the 10 to 20 millimeter polypectomy range. And then what we see, and experts tend to have a lower incomplete resection rate than no experts. And if we look at the meta-analysis data, submucosal injection itself did not influence the incomplete resection rate. And if we compare hot versus cold, we also found no difference. So if we lump all the studies together, we see that it's really the expert endoscopist and the polyp size that are the factors influencing that. And Heiko Pohl has published this landmark study, the CARE study. Back in the days, it was hot snare polypectomy for the standard polypectomy, and he has taken the margin biopsies to look after polypectomy. Is the polypectomy complete? And he has found there are high rates of incomplete resection. So in line with the meta-analysis, 10% overall incomplete resection. And the most concerning thing is that especially the serrated lesions have a very high rate of incomplete resection, found here 30%, and the larger serrated lesions, he found almost 50%. And as said before, the interval colorectal cancers, as mentioned by Evelien before, we often find these pathways of the serrated pathways in them. And so when cold snare came out, the initial hope was, oh, we can now switch to cold snare. It will reduce the complication risk, but it might also just affect incomplete resection rate. So we did a study here at my center at CHUM, replicating the study Heiko Pohl did, looking at the same size range of polyps and using just cold snare as primary approach and doing margin biopsy similar to the CARE study. And what we found is that the incomplete resection rate pretty much stay the same. Like they don't go down just by using a cold snare instead of a hot snare. What was interesting that also the smaller 4 to 9 millimeter size polyps had a high incomplete resection rate, which I think might be a result of using a 9 to 10 millimeter snare for 7, 8 millimeter polyps that can't be such a big healthy resection margins. And our results also showed serrated lesions have the highest risk for incomplete resection. So there were our take-home points. The just switching, replacing hot snare by cold snare is not resolving that issue. We still end up with a high incomplete resection rate. And then we looked a bit at these individual studies in the meta-analysis and looked at what did studies do that had a really low incomplete resection rate. And there was, interestingly, in the 10 to 20 millimeter range, where there's only very few studies available, there's one study from Australia, they only had 2%. incomplete resection rate. So we looked at the details, what are they doing? And if you look at this study, it's all the endoscopies and polypectomies are performed by a selected group of expert endoscopists. And basically they use a cold EMR style resection, meaning injection, wide field resection for all polypectomies. And interestingly, they addressed sessile serrated lesions with the highest risk of incomplete resection. And using these EMR technique also for smaller polyps, they had this very low incomplete resection rate, and they looked at recurrence rate also, which were congruent with a low incomplete resection rates. So this is the image, cold snare EMR for a mid-sized serrated lesion and these impressively low incomplete resection rate. So the idea was then what happens if we transfer a bit the EMR technique, the wide field resection also to smaller polyps, and that's a study we just completed at SCHM, where we addressed the standard polypectomies 4 to 20 millimeter, always injection, always wide field resection, and I was really advising all participating endoscopists to be aggressive, getting wide resection margins, getting a wide field resection around the polyp, trying to aim for potentially that the resection area is twice the size of the initial polyp. And you see here it's a smaller serrated lesion, and it's 3 bites with 3 snare resections with a cold snare. There's this little pedunculum that happens with cold snare, which is not an adenoma typically, but just making sure there is a wide resection around it. And the blue helps in addition to identify the margin. So we just completed this study, standard methodology as we had in the CARE study, as we had in the cold care study, screening, surveillance, colonoscopies, and we're taking margin biopsy to look for complete resection status. This is the interim analysis of the first 300 patients. We have 435 patients now completed, and I'm looking at the final outcome, but it seems to confirm that we have a low incomplete resection rate of 4.4% in that study. And that is for our center compared to the previous data, an almost 10% drop in incomplete resection rate, which is quite impressive, and a very high technical success rate using cold snare polypectomy for all these polyps. And again, we see the sessile serrated lesions, they have a bit higher risk of incomplete resection, and the adenomatous polyps have a very low incomplete resection rate. And we also see there's a lower risk for the smaller and the bigger polyps compared to just using cold snare or to using hot snare polypectomy here put next to it in the outcomes for incomplete resection rate. Now is the big question, where should we start? In this study, we started at 4 millimeter, which might be a bit low. And we ask in a survey endoscopists, what size do you start using submucosal injection? And most endoscopists feel it's reasonable starting somewhere around 10, which I find makes sense. But I also want to mention that we clearly found in our 2 studies that using submucosal injection, wide field resection lowered the incomplete resection rate when using cold snare also for 5 to 9 millimeter polyps. So the take-home points for me for standard polyp resection is that its incomplete resection is common, especially for sessile serrated lesions. It's a major risk factor for interval colorectal cancers. And after polypectomies that seem visibly complete, we still find polyp remnants in about 15% of cases. Incomplete resection is equally high if you use simply cold snare or hot snare polypectomy, and it tends to increase with polyp size. Polypectomy expertise and aiming for wide resection margin will likely reduce incomplete resection, especially for sessile serrated lesions. And there was this recent paper by the Australian group. Injection, wide field resection, cold snare seems to be the standard technique we should use right now. And I also think endoscopists should consider using cold snare with injection and wide field resection for other smaller than 20 millimeter lesions. However, the ideal size still requires to be defined. So thank you very much. And after this introduction, we'll see if there are any questions right now. And please also put any questions into the Q&A for the end. And if there are no questions right now, given the advanced time, I think another important point is really the adequate training and expertise for polypectomies. So I would hand it over to Kevin Waschke, who's a professor at McGill University and has said an excellent teacher and very well known through his involvement in the STAR courses and also in the Canadian colonoscopy training courses and polypectomy training courses. So Kevin, thank you for giving that talk and
all right. Thank you for the kind introduction. I was getting texts saying I should train my resident in my scope room now while I'm doing the talk, but I'm going to focus on the participants instead. So I agree that teaching and training is a critical issue, and I think even with AI, there's always room to train better. And the question that is there a need for polypectomy training, I think was already answered by the previous talk. It's a resounding yes. But when I travel around the world and I meet different trainers, what I realize is, and what the British group and our group and Australian group, many groups have looked at this and realized that we definitely need a consensus on training. We've been talking about this for a long time, and not everyone has really the same concept of what we mean by training. And if you were to read in the fields of educational psychology and look and say, what does training mean? What does learning mean? There's a lot of scientific evidence supporting how experts develop, and we're not really using that really well. In the courses that we've done, the STAR course, our Canadian C program, the UK courses, we integrate all these principles and we get really effective training really quickly to very high levels. But when you look at the literature, you see there's a huge need. In this talk, you just heard about, incomplete resection. It's not one technique, it's all techniques suffer by this. And one of the main reasons this is because self-assessment of skill is typically inaccurate 3/4 of the time. And so everyone always thinks they're above average. If you think about yourself and go, do I have a good sense of humor? Am I good looking? Am I funny? Do I get along with people? It's really rare that people say they're below average. And so that's why study after study show these incomplete resections, the rates of residual adenoma, for instance, after this cold biopsy forceps. So pretty much for any technique in polypectomy, there's always room for improvement, no matter how many years someone's been in practice. And with the courses we've actually seen, we get unexpected outcomes as well. When we've improved colonoscopy technique to improve tip control, we've actually gotten ergonomic benefits from it as well, and had people who were near retirement get another 10 years onto their practice. And for a healthcare system that's short on healthcare practitioners, that's a huge impact. The next step when you take any training issue for each person is highly individualized, and that's going to make it harder to study because each person is going to be at a different point on their learning pathway. So if you say, well, we're talking about polypectomy training, it's a huge topic. There's many areas. We could look and just say if we improve someone's cecal intubation rate and they were better at loop resolution and had better tip control, then the AI is going to have a better impact because the AI is not going to see the polyp if it doesn't appear on the image. And we know from polyp detection that all the endoscopist movements looking in different directions are critical. And it's not purely about the withdrawal time. So when we look at things like an adenoma detection rate, we could design courses to improve those. Certainly, it's true we could do things for optical diagnosis of polyps web-based or other ways and scalable. But when we look at specific techniques, for instance, cold snare, EMR, ESD, or even just routine snare polypectomy, those are hands-on skills that need in-person training with either simulators and or patients, depending on what element you're doing. And in our STAR courses in the ASG, we've noticed that you can look at someone's injection and that will tell you a lot about whether that person's capable of doing EMR. Because if you do a bad injection, it's very hard to do a good EMR afterwards. So when we look at polyp recurrence after polypectomy, or even if we're looking at things like learning a new technique in residency or when you're in practice, the contexts are different, and the scenarios, the amount of time it takes and the ability to make those improvements really depends from person to person. And there's a lot of elements to consider. So specifically, if we were to say, how do we tackle the fact that too many polyps get referred for surgery? How do we remove that? There's an element of knowledge and awareness, and then there's also skill sets, and then there's also health economic issues. And so you could tackle this idea of training and polypectomy from many different areas, but all of them are amenable to teaching or training and can have an impact, but it has to be designed and has to be thought out in advance. So when you look at that, you have a whole host of things. And yes, it's true that COVID has shown us that there's a whole scalability. I do a lot of e-learning work with ASG, and we've seen huge uptake from that, and even looked at things like using VR devices and AR and augmented reality. But even, like when I'm teaching EMR to my residents, using atlases and other things to kind of get the preliminary information is still useful. So there is still a role for things like lectures and videos, but there's also just human interaction and discussion. When you start moving into different elements like the hands-on part, certainly hands-on training with models or simulators are helpful. You can do live endoscopy courses, but you can watch at a distance for a hybrid depending on someone's schedule or someone's in a remote region. And obviously hands-on training with actual patients is relevant at certain time points, but doesn't need to be there at all elements. If you were to summarize all the educational literature, my personal opinion, which I know is shared by many people, is that standardized formal training with ongoing one-on-one assessment and feedback by consciously competent trainers gives you the best results. And if you don't know what that means, I would refer you to this WEO paper, ASG combined white paper, that basically talks about the principles of endoscopic training. And many of the people on this paper are world leaders in endoscopy training. And they've all came to the same agreement that there is a need to formally train endoscopy trainers, get a consensus of how we're teaching. And when you have novice and intermediate learners, a consistent approach really helps people develop their skills. So if you want to read this article, that will help you understand some of the concepts behind what I'm talking about today. If you do have an individual learner in front of you, you have to diagnose the learner. What are their learning needs? What do they already come to the table with? Maybe there's misconceptions in in their knowledge base. Maybe they're right up to where they need to be. What experience have they had? Is it their first time driving the car, so to speak, or have they had many attempts at it? Were some of those experiences negative, positive? There's a lot of contextual information you can get. And also, what do they want to learn? I remember teaching a colonoscopy course to beginners, and the person took me aside at the break and said, well, this is interesting, but what I really want to learn from you is ESD, because I know you do that. And this was their 25th colonoscopy. So you can imagine how I reacted to that. So the question is, how much time do you have, right? And what do you think they need to learn? Those are, so planning your teaching session in advance and doing a lot of preparation is really key. So if you were to think about polypectomy, and in the courses we've designed, we've tried to break down how do experts think and show people the different steps, even to the point of how do I plan my endoscopy day and how do I plan with accessories in the room? What do I do during the procedure? How do I inspect? What are the steps I do? What am I looking for when I'm looking? What classification systems do I use? What techniques do I use when I'm removing the polyp? How am I optimizing my scope handling? How do I lay the snare? How big is the snare open? And elements to teach the nurses in terms of closure and so on. And then even afterwards, are you telling the people who've had polypectomy numerous times to screen their first degree relatives, and what are the appropriate intervals and so on. So the training for all these elements takes time. So you have to focus your efforts and make sure you're concentrating on one item at a time. In terms of the key element, if you were to remember one thing from my talk, is assessment and feedback. Again and again and again. Assessment feedback is critical for training. It's not just about delivering information. You have to adapt your training to each learner. And like I mentioned with that ESD idea, the aligning the agendas, make sure you both are motivated to learn the same thing. And you're going to set specific learning objectives in a session before you even start. And then when you give feedback at the end, it should link back to that pre-stated learning objective, and you should be trying to improve performance. It shouldn't be just, you did a great job, or wow, you maybe should take another career, or let the AI take over, right? You need to actually make people have a plan of what to do next, step by step, and adapt the training as the skills evolve for each learner. And so if you're doing polypectomy and you're in the clinical setting, you could use some of these tools like skills assessment tools like the direct observation, and you can, you know, categorize the skill level. And then depending on the type of polyp, in this paper published in Gastrointestinal Endoscopy, you can have general terms, or you could have specific items related to pedunculated polyps or sessile polyps. And this is a checklist that you can use. And you can see that each of these elements in itself could have specific training dedicated to that element. When you look at a video like this, you can do a video assessment of cold snare polypectomy. So you're watching this, you could go, okay, is the distension okay? Do I have a wide margin? Should I have injected first based on the previous lecture? Is the recovery of the polyp, good? If we were to do an ESD, there's published data showing that video assessments can really help in terms of skill development as well. So regardless of the technique, recording cases and for later discussion can be useful as well. And that fits with the scalability we were talking before of e-learning. And we have a lot of experience, as you mentioned before. So the CAG program, what we call endoscopic polypectomy, where we have a simulator, a setting with live, with models and didactic lectures and a lot of in-person interaction using the different accessories, exploring different skill sets in small groups, practicing lifting and using a hot snare, and having direct observation and feedback customized to each individual. And this is extremely effective. This is general polypectomy, and in the STAR program mentioned before, we do that for endoscopic mucosal resection in the ASG, and it really changes people's behaviors and changes practice quite significantly. So, the take-home message I like, to kind of show is that if we know that polypectomy is such an important tool, we cannot accept the status quo. We have to train and teach better, but to do that, we have to do it in a formal way. We have to have formal training of endoscopy trainers, and that this is achievable. It's already been done for more than a decade in Canada and UK and other countries, and it works. So there's sufficient knowledge already of best practices in training to allow effective training of all elements in a variety of formats and settings. And yes, we can capitalize on e-learning as well. And yes, we can integrate AI into all of these elements, but it all starts from diagnosing the problem. What does the learner need and how do we move forward? So I will pause there and thank you for your attention.
Thank you for this excellent talk, Kevin. I think it's such an important topic, and I think that training is so essential also to bring the endoscopy skills to a broader endoscopy group, and not because we the research group where these high-level endoscopists, and then even we have 15% incomplete resection. So really teaching us and also like making the knowledge available is a fantastic endeavor. I see that there is a hand raised, right, from one of the panel members. Is that correct?
Hi, Daniel. Can I ask one question, Kevin? Thank you very much for your fantastic lecture. I have learned a lot of things from your presentation. I have just one simple question. Which one is more effective, whether giving the individual education course to the endoscopists or offering the train the trainer course? I think sometimes the training the supervisor is more effective than individual training. And do you have any experience on creating or establishing this kind of training scheme?
Yes, that's an excellent question. And when we first learned about this from our UK colleagues, we developed what's called the Skills Enhancement Endoscopy program in Canada, and we started training the trainers in all our programs, residency programs. So it's really, I would say about 100% of Canadian GI residents get exposure to consciously competent trainers. So basically, it's much more effective to go to the source and to not keep putting out people who are learning the same thing as before. So, using using these colonoscopy techniques to improve colonoscopy skills, improve tip control, gets a lot of quick successes, and then it changes the mentality, and people are more open to learning new techniques and don't withdraw from some of the more difficult topics. And I would say that all the evidence about training, let's say a basketball player or tennis player or chess player, these are all the same concepts. And if you have consciously competent trainers, it's more cost effective, it's faster, it's easier, and there's wins across the board. I would say that even the weekend course done in Poland showed on a randomized control trial changes in patient outcomes that were, a year later. So a 24-hour course can have a huge impact. And if you train a trainer for a lifetime, then, who knows what the outcomes are? There must be incredible.
Thank you.
Thanks for your question.
Thank you. If there are no questions, we would move on to the next speaker, and it's my pleasure to introduce Jeff Mosko. Jeff has done an advanced endoscopy fellowship at Harvard. He's a professor at Toronto University, and he's the director of postgraduate education. He's also the co-director of the international endoscopy course that happens every year in Toronto. And I know him as one of the most skilled endoscopists on advanced tissue resection and resection of large colorectal polyps with ESD or EMR techniques. So thank you, Jeff, for taking this talk.
All right. Well, thanks, Daniel, for inviting me, and to the committee for having me. I really appreciate being here and speaking on behalf of our group. And Kevin, thank you in advance for offering to come and coach me after watching some of these videos. You may see that I need your help. Anyways, we're going to thanks to everyone for sticking around till the end of the webinar. So we're going to talk about endoscopic resection of large polyps, and we're going to talk about both hot and cold EMR. EMR, as many of you know, remains the technique of choice for the majority of large colonic polyps here. We're talking about polyps greater than 20 millimeters in size. It has been extensively refined, the technique, over the last 10 years. And as you can see on the right, it involves injection of some sort of chromoinjectate into the submucosal space and systematic tissue resection. It is still the technique of choice for many reasons. It is effective, and we'll talk about that. It is available and can be done by many advanced and non-advanced endoscopists, and it is both less morbid and less costly when compared to the surgical alternatives. Many factors influence our approach to lesions. That includes histology, morphology, location, and the risk of submucosally invasive cancer and submucosal fibrosis. So EMR is not the technique for everything. Of course, we often need en-bloc resection and or ESD for lesions with optical features consistent with superficial submucosally invasive cancer, with advanced Kudo pip pattern and or JNET 2B lesions or above, or lesions at high risk of covert cancer. And obviously lesions with deep submucosally invasive cancer need to go to surgery. Endoscopic mucosal resection is not without its drawbacks. You can see on the top left, we have issues with incomplete resection recurrence, which you've heard about, more pronounced with larger lesions. Perforation, this was a lesion actually that I did yesterday, and you can see both target sign on the specimen and perforation on the lesion, as well as bleeding, which I seem to cause a lot of. And the data supports this issue. And so post-EMR recurrence for larger lesions remains an issue. The first paper in the Red Journal in 2014 showed a 32% recurrence rate, but they included both inconspicuous and biopsy proven residual and recurrence. That was out of 2 centers and Horst Neuhaus's group. The second was a Japanese meta-analysis published in 2015 comparing EMR to ESD, and that showed a 12% recurrence. And finally, a paper out of the Netherlands in 2017 showed just under 20% recurrence rate. Finally, there's data on the bottom from Michael Burke's group and the ACE cohort, again, before they introduced new techniques, a 20 to 23% both endoscopic and histologic recurrence. So definitely an issue. This is our data from a large referral center. This was retrospective, looking at all non-pedunculated polyps greater than 2 centimeters removed with EMR, and our recurrence rate was 15%, of it much lower when you use the ACE cohort inclusion. Many of these lesions were SMSA4 and so difficult lesions, and the need for adjunctive techniques was quite high. So no matter what, this is something that we certainly need to improve on. And so, you know, we need an approach to preventing adenoma recurrence, and that consists of many things and alludes to some of the things that both Kevin and Daniel were talking about. We absolutely need to pick the appropriate technique, be it injection, non-injection, hot EMR versus cold snare polypectomy. We need to perform high quality EMR, making sure that we're operating within our skill sets. And we need to aim for complete resections. And whether that's using the right equipment, again, the right technique, using our optical diagnosis skills, and or improving our skill set. And then we have thermal ablation to the edges. And so again, this paper from the ACE cohort looked at over 1,000 lesions from 25 to 45 millimeters. And when they were able to perform uniform snare tip soft coagulation to the margins, so-called EMRT, they were able to decrease their recurrence to around 1.4%, which is again approaching the ESD level recurrence. And you can see the technique demonstrated on the bottom right. We just used the tip of the snare and work around the lesion and burn the edge to the mucosa. The other issues with EMR, of course, are perforation, but that seems to be less of an issue as most of the deep neural injury is not clinically significant and can be closed at the time of the procedure, both not requiring admission and not causing any morbidity to the patients. And of course, there's bleeding too. The bottom left is a lesion that was clip closed, but seemed to bleed anyways. And this is data from Heikel Pohl's study, which compared clip versus no clip and our ESU settings, just looking at clipping and the number needed to treat for right-sided lesions. So many aspects of EMR that require some attention. So why should we consider cold snare EMR for lesions greater than 20 millimeters? This is a cecal polyp that was sent to me for resection. And as you can see, this is a high definition Olympus-scope with narrowband imaging. And yet the borders of the lesion are still somewhat hard to identify. This is a right-sided lesion, again, as I said, in the cecum. So you have all the issues that I talked about: risk of perforation, risk of bleeding, and of course, risk of incomplete resection. And so there's data now showing that experiences with large sessile colonic polyps greater than 20 millimeters. This is Alan Moss and his 5 Aussie centers retrospectively looking at lesions removed by a cold snare EMR. About a third of them were greater than 30 millimeters, most in the proximal colon, and 2/3 of them were sessile serrated polyps. He had a recurrence rate at SC1 similar to data on hot snare EMR and a low complication rate. And so he concluded that cold snare EMR for these lesions seemed to be similarly efficacious with an enhanced safety profile versus conventional EMR. This is Alessandro Rapici and his systematic review and pooled analysis looking at 8 studies and over 500 polyps. Again, slightly smaller mean size here, but looked at lesions 10 to 60 millimeters. And here he found actually the complete resection rate was significantly higher and only a 4% recurrence, but lower for sessile serrated polyps. And so he concluded here that there seems to be a significantly reduced adverse event profile, potentially lower cost, shorter time, and increased efficacy. Doug Rex published his personal experience for serrated lesions greater than 10 millimeters, over 500 lesions, all lifted with viscous solution. And again, he had no serious adverse events. So we're seeing a signal here for improved safety with a residual lesion rate of 8%. But again, he did include positive scar biopsies. And so he concluded that cold EMR appears to be safe and likely better for serrated lesions. This is the study which Daniel already alluded to. This is a time series analysis by, again, the ACE cohort and Michael's group that looked at historical classic EMR 400 lesions, which had 5% delayed bleeding, 3.5% deep neural injury, and a 4% recurrence, and compared that to piecemeal cold snare EMR with injection, and where he found to have no delayed bleeding or deep neural injury and a similar recurrence rate. Again, concluding that cold snare EMR seems to be equally efficacious without the complication rate. So this is that cecal polyp, which again, I'm lifting with chromoinjectate. So here I'm using saline, methylene blue, and dilute epinephrine 1 in 100,000. While it does obscure a little bit of the margin delineation, I find that it gets rid of a lot of the capillary bleeding that you often get. This is a dedicated cold snare that we're using. And so you're grabbing very small amounts of tissue and working your way from margin to margin. You can see there's still a little bit of bleeding, but again, this is not clinically significant bleeding. And so we slowly work our way around the lesion. And what you can see is because there's no electrosurgical energy, you're able to see the exact margin. And this is what we're left with at the end, an area that has very, very low risk of bleeding and virtually no risk of perforation either. And so my current approach to these lesions is that if you have a tubular adenoma that's Paris 2A, less than 5 millimeters, 5 to 10, I like using cold snare polypectomy without injection. Once you get into the 10 and greater area, we really don't know what the best approach is for adenomas. I think if their profile is quite flat, then it's reasonable to take them off cold. But again, there is a randomized control trial coming that should answer this question. For 1S lesions and tubular adenomas, I still like to use heat with injection. For any serrated polyps, I think cold snare EMR is here to stay based on its improved efficacy and improved safety profile. And of course, any intramucosal or submucosal invasive cancer needs to be removed with heat or potentially en bloc with an advanced technique. And I think the data is still not clear on what to do when you have an SSP with dysplasia, those very large lesions. I'm still taking out with heat. So there's still, the jury's still out on a few of these. Do we need to add any adjunctive techniques to our cold snare EMR technique? And I would argue that we still don't know, but in my experience, you can see on the bottom here is a hot EMR where you can see this rim of artifact that happens after you've used electrosurgical energy. Compare that to a similarly sized lesion that you're taking off cold, and you can see really well around the margin. And so the thought behind this EMRT or thermal ablation to the margin is that there may be cells at the margin that weren't seen microscopically that can go back, and therefore thermal ablation is going to help with that. But with your cold snare technique, you're able to see that margin really well. So this is that same cold snare EMR. You can see that there's a little bit of polyp tissue around the margin. And so you're able to go after that using your cold technique. And so when the margin is very visible, you're able to take quite like a large rim of normal mucosa. And therefore, I'm not convinced that ablating the margin or using snare tip soft coag to the margin at least is going to provide benefit. But again, we don't have answers to this yet. So currently I'm not adding thermal ablation to the margins of cold snare EMR because I'm able to see around the margin. And when in doubt, I just take a larger rim of normal mucosa. And I know Daniel has data when he goes around the margin with a cold snare to use that instead. So this is, our resection algorithm technique. And again, this was recently published by Neil Shahidi and Michael Burke. And really it stresses the optical diagnosis, which relates back to the AI discussion that we've had before. So if you think this is a serrated polyp, then you should be removing it by cold snare resection. If you think it's adenoma, I'm often still using EMR, as you can see by my chart. If there's features of superficially submucosally invasive cancer or high risk of covert submucosally invasive cancer, like large 1S lesions in the rectum, ESD makes the most sense. And obviously, if there's deep submucosally invasive cancer, this needs to go to surgery and be reviewed by a multidisciplinary team. So again, thank you so much for your attention. I really appreciate being here and for your time. So thanks again.
Thank you so much for this excellent talk, Jeff. Also, thank you to all the people joining the webinar here, and we have a lot of people staying on, which really speaks to the quality of the speaker and this interesting discussion. Are there any question, comments from the panel for Jeff?
Yeah. Jeff, thank you very much for your kind. No, it's a really nice lecture. Thank you very much. I have learned a lot of things. So basically, I think the precise optical diagnosis will be the prerequisite to challenge the larger lesions with the cold polypectomy. But however, if you look at the actual practice, the sensitivity to identify the invasive cancer is less than 80%, honestly speaking, which means that you will remove the some submucosally invasive cancer unintentionally. What do you think about this risk?
Yeah, so you're right on, and what that's implying is that we are under treating a lot of lesions with EMR, and the reason that we're doing that in North America mostly is for reasons of skill and resource allocation. And so for lesions that in Japan you might remove by ESD, we're still saying that they can be removed by EMR here, mostly because colorectal ESD is not widely available. And so there is that subset of patients that, as you were alluding to, that are going to be undertreated by EMR. So I think that optical diagnosis is just one way of determining the risk of submucosally invasive cancer. The ACE cohort has other data that combines Paris classification and granularity of the polyp to help people decide. And that data also probably overestimates the skill set of the general endoscopist at being able to determine if there's cancer there. So we are improving when you're talking about flat polyps. We're maybe not so good with other polyps, but yes, there is a subset of people who are undertreated by EMR. And so, in our center, we're doing more and more hybrid EMR for lesions that are at increased risk, like you said, and colorectal ESD, but that at this time, that's just not realistic to be widespread across North America for various reasons.
Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much, everyone. I'm just checking. There is a question from Roland Valori asking, conventional view is you don't need to lift small lesions. Do you think there's a case for lifting smaller lesions if access is tricky? Excellent question. Personally, yes. I would sometimes can really lift them out of a pocket and get the snare much nicer around them. I think the main thing for the very small, always try to aim for a snare and not try to get them out with a forceps. I think that's an important point. My tendency is also to move to smaller lesions, but we will need more data on that. I know there's a few randomized control trials coming. Doug Rex has one trial, lifting, no lifting, hot snare, cold snare. And I also think in that context, it really depends on the technical skills. So depending on the level of endoscopy skill, it might help you more or less adding lifting to the polypectomy technique. Is there any other comment, question from the panel?
Oh, yes, Daniel, I'd like to ask the panelists to give us some perspective on the use of underwater EMR, because today non-speakers have mentioned the underwater EMR, and underwater EMR is going to be a kind of option for polyps larger than 20 millimeter, especially in the situation where you don't have ESD. So I'd like to hear your opinions on this issue.
Sure, yeah, I can start. I think underwater EMR is interesting in terms of its ability to achieve en bloc resection for lesions greater than 20 millimeters. My current use is at the appendiceal orifice and for recurrent lesions, lesions that are difficult to grab, lesions that aren't necessarily lifting. And so I'm not using it as a primary technique. I think that in a lesion that I want to remove en bloc, I'm more likely to use a hybrid EMR technique versus a underwater. But I think it is reasonable as a skill advancement technique to achieve more en bloc resection for those who aren't comfortable with ESD. So I appreciate the data on underwater. I think you are losing some of the benefits of your injection in terms of margin delineation and in terms of potentially safety profile. So I think, just like anything, it should be part of our skill set and decision-making algorithm. I'm not using it as a primary technique right now, but of course interested in what Kevin and Daniel are doing.
Yeah, Kevin, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I would say that taking it one step backwards, I would say that like with our colonoscopy training courses, we see our residents get better and better results with water exchange or just, like water insufflation CO2. And then as they do that, they view it as a tool. And then we try and teach them to, like with Roland's question, to lift everything that's even a little bit sketchy for them. And then we always teach them to use water for flushing and clean. And so they all become tools that you end up doing, as opposed to like for everything, you start getting to know when they have a benefit and when they don't. And I would say that in the most difficult access cases like Jeff, I would have the same practice. I would tend to, like yesterday, I did one in the appendiceal orifice and that was completely underwater and it went much better than had I done certain other techniques. So I think the higher in skill level you get, the more you use all these things to their advantage. And I think there's no downside to it in that sense.
And one thing that I teach always is to be ready to pivot between techniques, right? And so if you're starting an EMR and either you're just not able to get a snare around an area or it's fibrotic, you have to be ready to pivot to use something else. So I'll convert to underwater very quickly in order to efficiently remove a polyp. I do the same during ESD. So if I'm having trouble finding the submucosal plane, it's not injecting, I'll just convert to underwater and I find that's or saline, and I'll find that's useful. So I think these techniques are not supposed to stand alone. I mix hot and cold. I mix injection and underwater. The idea is for complete resection, and so it's really from my standpoint, it's whatever it takes to get there.
Great, thank you everyone for this lively and inspiring discussion. I think we were going to get to the closing of the session. We also wanted to mention that there are 2 more WEO meetings, webinars on December 2 and 9, if we can have the slide for that. I think this amazing set of speakers and for the inspiring talks and the discussion. Evelien, do you have some also closing remarks for us to say?
Just thanking you, because I really enjoyed this session. It was really nice. Thank you so much for the high-level talks, for the nice discussions, many topics to elaborate on and to further think about. And I also would like to thank the Secretariat and especially Alexandra and Ruth for organizing again this webinar, which they did in an excellent way. Thanks, Danielle. To you to close.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Yuichi. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Have a good day, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much.